Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another installment of SIBA's Reader Meet Writer. I'm your host, Wiley Cash. I am the 2019 recipient of SIBA's Pat Conroy Legacy Prize, and I am the writer in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. And we are here for a very special event this evening that I'll get to in just a moment. I want to talk about SIBA at the top of the show as we are all loading into the room here and finding a place to sit in our various folding chairs. SIBA stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. SIBA represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And perhaps one of those bookstores brought you here tonight. You saw Mr. Mitchell's event on their web calendar. You received an email. But you are here tonight probably because one of those bookstores let you know about this important event. Please reward them by purchasing the paperback or the hardcover of Mr. Mitchell's book from that store or any other books you want to pick up this evening, and support the indie bookstores that are the lifeblood of our literary and cultural communities. Tonight's event, we are hosting Jerry Mitchell for his book, Race Against Time. A reporter reopens the unsolved mysteries of the civil rights era. Next week, Thursday, a week from tonight, we'll be hosting Ed Tarkington as he discusses his new novel, The Fortunate Ones, Thursday, February 18th at 7 p.m. So tonight, Jerry Mitchell is going to do a presentation about a couple of the cases that he covers in this groundbreaking and very important book. And then I'll come back on and he and I will chat a little bit. If at any moment during tonight's event, you have a question, something that you want a little more information on, something you've made an interesting connection you want to share, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type your question in at that moment, whenever it strikes your mind. We won't be able to see it. It won't interrupt anything. And at the end of the show, I'll share your question with Jerry. So make sure you mention your name and your home independent bookstore, and I will share your question with him. I have quite a long introduction. I will summarize it very, very quickly. Jerry Mitchell is an investigative reporter in Mississippi. In the late 1980s, he began delving deeply into some of the great unsolved and unresolved murders of the civil rights era. Medgar Evers, the four little girls in the church. And his work led to convictions in these cases and was really historical social justice work brought about by some serious deep dive investigative reporting. He has quite the resume, quite the experience, and this is quite the book in terms both of its research and the quality, and it's something that I want to talk about a little bit later. The narrative drive of this book is breathtaking. This is not just a piece of investigative journalism. This is A+ storytelling with some serious narrative drive, and it's an excellent book. And it is an honor and it is a pleasure to welcome Jerry Mitchell to join us tonight. So Jerry, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Wiley. Thanks for a generous introduction there. And I'll try to make this quick. All right. We will start this. All right, here we go. So this is my book very quickly, A Race Against Time. And this photograph is a photograph of the burned out station wagon in what's commonly called the Mississippi burning case, the 3 civil rights workers that were killed. Actually, we might could squeeze some in the Q&A about that case, but I'm going to talk very quickly about the other 2 cases. I don't know if you're like me, but if someone tells me I can't have something, I want it like a million times worse. So there was something in Mississippi called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. A lot of the other southern states had very similar organizations, but it was kind of had 2 arms. One was a spy arm, and the other was a kind of a propaganda arm, and it was headed by the governor. But all these records of the Sovereignty Commission were sealed. There's like 132,000 pages of records. They were all sealed for 50 years by the Mississippi legislature. So when I found that out, I thought, yeah, there's got to be something in there. They wouldn't be sealing them for 50 years. So I began to develop sources who had access to the files, began to leak me the files. And what this showed at the same time, the state of Mississippi was prosecuting a guy named Byron D. LeBeckwith for the murder of Medgar Evers. This other arm of the state, the Sovereignty Commission, was secretly assisting the defense, trying to get him acquitted. And nobody knew that. At the time that my story, this is a picture of the driveway where Medgar Evers, he was shot in the back. The same night, by the way, President Kennedy told the nation that the grandsons of slaves were still not free. And so, as I mentioned, the odds were probably more than 1,000,000 to 1 against this case ever being reopened and re-prosecuted. The court file, there just wasn't anything in there, any kind of value when I went and looked at it. But this is Myrlie Evers, the widow of Medgar Evers. But she believed and she prayed, and some amazing things happened. A couple months later, Jackson police are cleaning out a closet, happened to find a box that contained the crime scene photographs of the killing of Medgar Evers, including the fingerprint of Byron D. LeBeckwith lifted. That's Byron D. LeBeckwith there, lifted from the murder weapon. And then a few months after that, she shared with me her copy of the court transcript she saved in a safety deposit box. And a few months after that, Bobby DeLauder, who's a prosecutor in the case, found the murder weapon in his father-in-law's closet, which sounds like I'm making it up, but it really did happen. But I went to go interview Byron D. LeBeckwith. He lived in Signal Mountain, Tennessee, which is outside of Chattanooga. Absolutely the most racist person I ever spent serious time with. N-word this, N-word that. We talked for about 6 hours. It was starting to get dark, and he insisted on like walking me out to my car. And I'm like, really? That's okay. I think I can find my way. So he walks me out to the car, and when he gets me out there, says, if you write positive things about white Caucasian Christians, God will bless you. You do not write positive things. If you write negative things about white Caucasian Christians, God will punish you. If God does not punish you, several individuals will do it for him. And so his wife had made me a sandwich. I think you can guess what I did with the sandwich. So Byron D. LeBeckwith did get indicted for the murder of Medgar Evers. He was extradited back to Mississippi. He fought extradition, but lost that battle. And wound up in the courtroom. At the time I went and interviewed him, he didn't know I was the one that wrote the story that got the case reopened. You know, this is pre-internet, remember? But by this time he'd figured it out. So he saw me across the courtroom when he came into the courtroom that day. And he pointed at me across the room, was talking to somebody else, says, see that boy over there? When he dies, he's going to Africa. And I turned to a friend of mine and went, you know, I've always wanted to go to Africa. So Byron D. LeBeckwith was convicted on February 5th, 1994, almost 30 years to the day of when he was tried in the exact same courtroom. And when the word guilty rang out, you could hear the waves of joy as they kind of cascaded down the hall till it reached a foyer full of people, black and white, just erupted in cheers. And Myrlie Evers and her daughter, Rena, cheered as well. And I just felt chills because the impossible had suddenly become possible. Not too long after Byron D. LeBeckwith was indicted in late 1990, a few months after that, I met with this woman. Her name is Ellie Damer, and she's holding a photograph of her late husband, Vernon Dyer. Vernon Dyer was a farmer, businessman, entrepreneur. And he was very dedicated, he was an NAACP leader, dedicated to voting rights. And the Klan didn't like that, attacked him and his family in the middle of the night, January 10th, 1966, set the house on fire, began firing their guns into the house. Vernon Dyer woke up, grabbed his shotgun, ran to the front of the house, began firing back the Klansmen so his family could escape safely out a back window. Unfortunately, the flames of the fire seared his lungs and he died later that day. A few weeks later in the mail came his voter registration card. He fought all his life for the right of all Americans to be able to vote. But he'd never been able to cast a ballot himself. And so just incredible. And so anyway, at the time he had 6 of his 7 sons ended up serving a total of 78 years in the armed forces. And 4 were in the military at the time. And this is what they returned home to find. In fact, as a bit of trivia, this photograph, to me, is one of the more moving photographs of the civil rights movement. And it's very few people know about it. But what's interesting to me about it is it was taken by Chris McNair, who's the father of Denise McNair, who's one of the 4 little girls that was killed in the Birmingham church bombing. The guy who ordered the killing of Vernon Dyer was this guy. His name is Sam Bowers, who's also the one that ordered the killing of the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi as well. So Bowers had been tried in this case and never been convicted. So after the Dahmer family met with me, they met with the district attorney. District attorney reopened the case. Seemed like he was earnest about it, but pretty quickly got cold feet. And then over time, then he left office, and then it was a whole new DA who didn't seem interested at all. It just looked like nothing was going to happen. So I ended up taking, I got a fellowship to go to Ohio State and get my master's basically for free at Ohio State. So I was literally in Ohio getting my master's in journalism, and I got this phone call from this guy who wouldn't identify himself, but said he had information in the Dahmer case and wanted to talk to me. So I flew back to Mississippi, met with him. I was him, a buddy of his, 2 sons of Vernon Dahmer. We were all in a motel room down the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And he basically told us that Sam Bowers, he had overheard Sam Bowers give the orders to kill Vernon Dahmer. So he came forward, then he met with the district attorney's office. The case got reopened in earnest. The guy had been the key witness back in the 1960s had been this guy. His name was Billy Roy Pitts, who was involved in the killing of Vernon Dahmer, dropped his gun, got caught, pleaded guilty to murder, got a life sentence for that, pleaded guilty to federal charges, got 5 years for that. So I was trying to find out exactly how much time he actually did. I could not find a record of his state time, which is like, what the heck? But what I was told was he went into the Federal Witness Protection Program. So I'm talking to an archivist at the U.S. Bureau of Prisons in Washington. And I said, okay, now how much time do you actually serve in federal prison? And she said 3.5 years. And I said, now understand that he left federal prison and went into the Witness Protection Program. And the archivist said, that's impossible. I said, what are you talking about? So there was no Witness Protection Program back then. So what this meant was Billy Roy Pitts never served a single day of his life sentence in Mississippi. Kind of a big oversight. And so I didn't know if this guy was alive, he's dead, where he was. So I got on the internet. This is, by this point, the internet's starting to become something that you can actually use. And so I went on there and knew with this one website, you didn't have to have a city or a state. You could just type in the name and up it popped. Billy Roy Pitts had his address, Denham Springs, Louisiana, has a telephone number. So I called him. First 20 minutes of the conversation went like this. How'd you find me? How'd you find me? Like, it's on the internet. The internet, I'm going to list the telephone number. I'm like, I guess you have to take it up with them. So as a result of the fact that, he had never served a single day of his life sentence, Mississippi authorities issued a warrant for his arrest. He didn't like that. In fact, he ran. And while he was on the run, he sent me this audio cassette. And when I got it, I played it, and this is how it began. Jerry, I just thought I'd let you know you've ruined my life. But I promised I'd talk to anybody. I'd talk to you. So here's this tape. And on this tape, he proceeds to tell me I was involved in killing Vernon Dahmer. I was involved in all this other Klan violence. So shortly after this, he turned himself into authorities. And this now leads to the arrest of Sam Bowers. Also arrested was Bowers' right-hand guy. His name is Devers Nix. And when the family brought Devers Nix in, it was like the most pitiful sight you've ever seen. They wheeled him in the wheelchair with the oxygen tank and get him up in front of the judge. And he's telling the judge, I can't take more than a couple steps without needing oxygen, judge. They're just like, well, I normally don't do this, but I'm going to let you out without bond. A dozen days later, this is like a reporter's dream. This is where we caught him playing golf. And so he got arrested. Yeah, he loved me. So fast forward, Sam Bowers goes on trial, and guess who's there to testify on his behalf? But Devers Nix, the golfer. And So he's talking to his lawyer, Mr. Nix is, before he gets up to testify. His lawyer's trying to work out a signaling system with him. And the thing you should know about his lawyers, the detail is, by now he's in his 80s, and he, was a great criminal defense lawyer in his day. And so anyway, he's trying to, like I said, work out this signaling system. He tells him, I just happened to overhear the conversation. Now, Devers, when you get up there, if you need to take the fifth, I'm going to raise my hand. Devers like, okay. And so Devers gets up, he starts testifying. I looked over his lawyer about 5 minutes later. You can probably guess this part was like, fast asleep. It was like, this is, a very serious trial, but it had to be one of the funniest trials I ever covered in my life. Just things that were just, you couldn't believe, you couldn't make up. The guy who was Bowers' lawyer, a guy on the right, his name is Travis Buckley. And the thing you should know about him, he's not just a lawyer for the Klan, he was a leader in the Klan. And so, anyway, he was actually arrested for the firebombing of Vernon Dyer at one point. So, all these things were, kind of known. So anyway, the prosecution is laying out their case. Billy Roy Pitts is testifying who all this planning meeting took place about a month prior to the attack on Vernon Dyer and his family. And, Pitts is like detailing who all was there. I was there. Sam Bowers was there. Devers Nix was there. Travis Buckley was there. And Buckley, just no reaction. And then the court reporter is like, what were those names again? So he goes back through them. Billy Roy Pitts, Sam Bowers, Travis Buckley, and all of a sudden Buckley shoots up. Objection, Your Honor. I've covered a lot of trials in my life. It's the only trial I ever covered where a witness implicated the defense lawyer himself. So Sam Bowers was convicted on August 21st, 1998, and sentenced to life in prison, just like Byron D. LeBeckwith. The unfortunate part is, that the hate that caused this has never really gone away. A little over 5 years ago, we had this happen in Charleston. A young man walked into this church and killed 9 beautiful people. And then not long after that, we had someone go in a synagogue in Pittsburgh and kill 11 people, strictly because of hate. And then in El Paso, we had a man drive from Dallas area to El Paso, and he killed 23 people and shot 23 others as well. And the reason he said he was doing it was to, quote unquote, halt the invasion, which happens to be the exact words that Sam Bowers spoke in the summer of '64 before they went out and killed the 3 civil rights workers. And of course, we've had George Floyd and the protests that have followed, which I've written about in my afterword, if you get my book. But of course, myself, in terms of my own experience, people ask me about, did you get threats? What kind of did you get? And to be honest, I've had, dozens of death threats from Klansmen, but it led to kind of an unexpected gift, and that's the gift of living fearlessly. And living fearlessly is not about living without fear. It's really about living beyond fear. It's about living for something greater than ourselves. And so that's really the lesson that I didn't expect to learn through this. To date now, there have been 24 convictions in these murders. And it's a matter of faith with me, but I believe God's hand's been involved in these cases. But the most amazing thing I witnessed actually not been the convictions, it's been some of the racial reconciliation. Not too long after Sam Bowers was convicted, Billy Roy Pitts walked to the back of a courtroom and he ran into Mrs. Dahmer. And he apologized to Mrs. Dahmer and asked her to forgive him for killing her husband. And she forgave him. And she began to cry. He began to cry. And isn't that really what redemption's all about? Trying to make things right, even when they've gone so terribly wrong in the past. But I'm grateful to be with you tonight. A couple of quick, very brief commercials, I guess you could say on my end. That's the book. We already talked about it. And this is my nonprofit that I started to basically continue to do the kind of investigative reporting wanted to do, because newsrooms are getting, for-profit newsrooms are just getting decimated right now. And this is my contact information. Daily, I post kind of today in civil rights history on Facebook and Twitter. And that's our website at the bottom, MississippiCIR.org. And that's my email. And that's it. I think and let me stop sharing. And there we go.
That was fascinating, Jerry. And I want to encourage everybody, after seeing some of those images, some of which are heart-rending and some of which are enraging. If you want to share thoughts or you have questions, go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll share those questions with Jerry at the end of our broadcast. But Jerry, one question I have for you, you really threw yourself into these cases and put yourself into some really sticky situations. And I'm wondering, before all of this, you began investigating these cases in the late 80s. How did you find your way into newsrooms in Mississippi? What was your journey into?
I got wind up in Mississippi. Yeah. Well, the simple answer is the same guy that was the Clarion Ledger, is where I did all this work. I worked there for over 3 decades. It's a statewide newspaper in Mississippi, for those that don't know. And the way I made my way there, pretty simple, is I'm from Texarkana, Texas, and my hometown newspaper, David Cabissa hired for me as an intern at my hometown paper. He was the editor there and then became the editor of the Clarion Ledger. So that's kind of what happened. And they had an opening and he offered me. I'd heard good things about the Clarion Ledger. I heard they won a Pulitzer. And so it seemed like a good place to go. And I liked David and he hired me.
I know you've covered a number of other cases, racial reconciliation, judicial bribes, all this kind of shifty legal stuff that we stereotypically think of in the Deep South, especially places like Mississippi, Louisiana, where I've spent plenty of time. But what got you to do these deep dives? Do it.
What got me into these cases?
Into these cases specifically, into these civil rights cases.
Well, it's kind of a two-pronged thing. I mentioned the Sovereignty Commission records because that's one piece of it. But before that, about a month before that, I happened to see a movie. I got assigned to go cover a movie, and it was called Mississippi Burning, which is a fictional film. But I happened to see it with 2 FBI agents who investigated the case, and that was, it changed the whole trajectory of my life. I mean, who would have guessed, but a newspaper assignment changes the trajectory of your whole life. And so I saw the movie. I had all these questions because I knew none of this. I mean, zero. And they started telling me, okay, this is what really happened, or they would explain what was on screen. And I was stunned to find out there were more than 20 Klansmen involved in killing these 3 young men, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. And nobody ever been prosecuted for murder. And that was the part I couldn't wrap my head around. I was like, wait a minute. No way, because I covered courts. I'm like, nobody ever got prosecuted for murder? More than 20 guys? What happened? And I couldn't figure it out. And that really bugged me and kind of drove me to look at that case especially. And then the Sovereignty Commission stuff came in about a month after that. So those 2 things kind of propelled me forward. Yeah.
Sure. And so, I know the Sovereignty Commission is kind of a legal roadblock or a freedom of information roadblock. And I imagine you, this young reporter, what kind of beats were you pulling before you dove headlong into civil rights buried?
It was insane. I was already working like 50, 60 hours a week. I mean, I was like, this was already insane. I was already in insane territory. And then I started pursuing these cases at the same time. Like this was sometimes reporters who want to be investigative reporters will say, well, I don't have time to do it, or I don't have a whole lot of sympathy, because I know what I did. It's just that you have to kind of take it on, and then at some point you prove yourself, and they'll let you have the time. But that's kind of what happened in my case.
You mentioned the three victims from the Mississippi burning case, which is the Gene Hackman movie, right? From
yeah. It's
the late
exactly
80s.
that's exactly the movie. And
And
the unfortunate thing about that movie is just that they make the FBI out to be like the great heroes, and the civil rights activists get made to look like almost like cowards, which is awful. Which wasn't true at all. So,
well, one thing that I thought was an interesting choice in the book is you decided to title the sections of the book after the victims and not the case titles, which most often reflect the names of the perpetrators.
correct.
So, can you talk about that decision and also the decision to focus so much on the victims, especially giving our contemporary fascination with true crime, which is all about the perpetrators?
That's true. That's true. Well, I thought that was important. And of course, I always tell people the greatest reward I've ever gotten has been getting to know these families. And I don't know, I felt strongly about that each of the section should be the names of the victims. I think that's at least, it seemed to make sense to me. I don't know, I want to honor them. I mean, I want to honor them. I don't want to honor the killers. I mean,
sure. One of the most powerful aspects of this book, and also one of the most readable aspects of the book, is what I mentioned at the top of the show in that kind of rather bumbling biography that I shared, that brief biography, is this narrative drive that you bring to the very first page. I mean, that first page throws you in. It's almost like a pulpy noir, grinding mystery novels writing. And, you're an investigative reporter, and not that those two things don't go hand in hand, but they often don't. And so I'm wondering, as a storyteller, was gathering that narrative momentum, was it a struggle? Was it a challenge? Was it a joy? Were you like, freedom,
Well, all writing is rewriting, isn't it? I mean, if you're really going to be honest about it. My experience at Ohio State really helped me. That's where I first learned about what sometimes gets called literary journalism or narrative journalism or whatever you want to call it. I had never done any of it until I got to Ohio State. And when I got to Ohio State, I just started reading all of it. We got assigned those. I've forgotten all the various books that I read, narrative journalism, and as well as pieces, from New Yorker and things like that. So that really first introduced me. So I did my first narrative piece while I was at Ohio State. Later it got published. It was called The Murder Club. And then did one called The Preacher and the Klansman. And it ran as a serial narrative, for like 13 chapters. And then did some other ones too. So that was really good experience in terms of writing a narrative as opposed to, and I did one on a serial killer that, in fact, the serial killer case that I worked on, and the guy got convicted after, by the way, nearly 54 years. I think it's probably the oldest solved cold case as far as I know in U.S. history, but it's certainly the oldest serial killer case. But that was same, and the way I decided to tell that story, the story kind of determines structure, if that makes any sense. And so with that one, it made sense, even though it was an investigative story, to tell it as a narrative. And in this case, I felt the same way. It just felt it needed to be like, what I had thought was, I want the reader to go with me on this. Like I knew nothing about any of this. So therefore the audience can kind of go in this with me and kind of follow me on the journey. And that was purposely, I mean, I tried to keep it moving. I didn't want it to flag. And I tried to weave in as much as possible the history, if that makes any sense. So not let the narrative flag, but weave in just enough history as you're going along. So you're picking up the history in the same way that I did as a reader. And that was kind of my motive and the way I structured it and did it. I don't know.
And you did it well. I mean, it's history written like a novel. It's really propulsive. It's really immediate. It's really, really well done. We have a number of questions lining up.
Yeah. Go ahead. Shoot.
You're on Douglas for a moment. But I have one question that as a Southerner, I'm born and raised in North Carolina. I still live in North Carolina. Can you, and you're from East Texas, can you talk about, after all of this work you've done, can you talk about how your personal relationship to the South has changed, has altered, has,
oh my goodness,
how survived, thrived, been challenged?
Well, I will say this is that I found out it's I guess V.O. Key wrote this line years ago, and hopefully I won't offend my Mississippi friends. I consider myself almost a Mississippian now. I've been in Mississippi so long, since '86. But V.O. Key wrote, "The North thinks that the South is one big Mississippi. The South understands the distinction."
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be harsh on Mississippi, but there's just a difference between the South and the Deep South. I'll put it that way, which obviously includes more than just Mississippi. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and into the Carolinas too. So anyway.
Yeah, I always tell people that the reason there are so many great writers from Mississippi is that the state of Mississippi sees itself as Mississippi against the world.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Very true. I mean, they definitely do. But go ahead.
We got a bunch of great questions. Jill asks, this is one of my favorite books ever. What do you think?
Wow. Thank you, Jill.
Yeah. What do you think about the legislative reform statement today in Mississippi?
I don't know. Maybe I missed it, Jill. I've been busy with some other stuff. So what is it she's referring?
Maybe she can clarify that.
I'll let her clarify it. Go to the next question.
And I'll come back.
I'm not sure what she's referring to exactly.
Joanna asks, and this is kind of a broad question that David Zucchino also got about his book about the 1898 insurrection in Wilmington. Mm-hmm. What do you suggest we can do about the current spread of white supremacy that seems so tied to certain people's identities in today's climate?
That's an excellent point. And I think that's I think you hit the nail on the head, which is identity. That as long as people have their identity from white supremacy, or, as long as we if we devolve, for lack of a better term, into what some people call tribalism, or whatever you want to call it, then that's problematic. We obviously want to be able to unite across those lines, across not just racial lines, political lines, all those things. Hopefully, if we've got a common cause, I would hope we could all work together on those things. But you hit the nail on the head. It's identity. That's the key. And that's what I sense is a lot of what's been going on in the past several years is identity. It's not, that's where people are getting their identities from.
Sure. And that's a really hard thing to peel away. It's like peeling skin off a skeleton for.
Yeah. Feel free to email me. I mean, we could talk about that more, but tell them to email. I'll post my email anyway.
Billy has a question, and it seems like Billy has done some sniffing around some of these cases as well. Billy asks, going back to the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, do you know anything about a character last name Gafford, who owned an auto parts store? He was investigated.
I've heard his name. I can find out more. I mean, I know someone's got the records. Who's got the bombing files? Yeah,
sure. Well, that kind of goes to a question a little bit farther down. Let me see who asked it. Pam at Parnassus Books in Nashville. Pam asks, do there remain unsolved murders from the civil rights era? And are there examples? And I'll add on to that. Is there a case that you have chased down that you can't get your hands around?
Well, the problem is in terms of prosecution, let's say, I don't know of any from the 60s that are viable anymore. And where it's like the perpetrators are dead, or the witnesses are dead, or whatever, those kind of things. A lot of those guys are in their 80s or like I said, dead at this point. But having said that, there are, other cases, I'm working on. There's what they call a no body. It's more like an Innocence Project case that I'm working on. It's a kind of a no body case. There's not a body. Mm-hmm. And the guy that testified was kind of the key prosecution witness was so mentally ill that they had to postpone the trial a half dozen times. So, there's so many cases, that I feel like that, need to be looked at in terms of injustices. And they're saying, and plus generally, it's true in Mississippi, and I think the South generally is, if we can sentence somebody, we sure love to over sentence them, because, we believe in just locking them up forever, and so that's another problem, which I know Mississippi legislature just passed, at least the Senate passed a bill and the House have passed a bill. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with all that.
Jill clarified, she said it's the Mississippi lawmakers advanced common sense criminal justice reform.
Yeah.
They have the second highest imprisonment rate in the nation.
Yeah, that's what she's talking about. I'm talking about. Yeah, we'll see what happens. The Senate has a bill and the House have a bill, and they're kind of different bills and address maybe some different things. So we'll see what they end up doing. I think there's hope for that, actually, because I think there's been some inclination by this legislature now to address some of that, because and then we've got a gap of people between 94 and 2014 when they did reform that are kind of caught in the middle. They didn't get the advantage of the reform. It was kind of a group of people in between. So there are a lot of things like that that need to be done, as well as the criminal law in Mississippi statutes need to be cleaned up anyway.
So to close this out here tonight, you talked about the story of Byron de la Beckwith and that kind of ominous trip out to your car and the fateful sandwich that who knows what that would have been.
I know, I never checked it out.
Are there other stories like that you look back on and you think, Jerry, what the hell were you thinking doing that?
When I wrote the book, I thought that. I was like, it's funny, you've got a little bit of distance of time, and I thought, as I read my own book, I thought, I was just nuts. I was just crazy. I'm gonna go talk to the killer of Meg Rivers. Why not? But that's the reporter, and you kind of get driven, and of course that whole section is so awful. My wife at the time was 8 months pregnant, and I'm running off to go talk to the killer of Meg Rivers. I am much more sympathetic now than I was at the time.
Sure, but it's a compulsion. I mean, you feel you're chasing history, and in terms of some of these cases, the ages of these perpetrators, history is passing before your eyes. Yeah,
and that's why I called it what I called it, which is race against time, which is, you're doing exactly that. You realize the clock is ticking. These guys are not going to be alive that much longer. The witnesses may be dead, all these kind of things. So that's why it was definitely a race against time. It was like a window was closing as I was working on these cases. I could tell that.
Which has to be such a panicky feeling, because cultural, social, historical sentiments are softening toward these racial injustices. But as those soften, these people are dying, and there's no. That's
like the three civil rights workers case. I mean, it took forever, but the advantage of that was there was a softening of sentiment, which if that case had been done in '89, I don't know if there would have been convictions. Mm-hmm. But Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is where this happened, now has a black mayor. So it's very fascinating. I mean, Mississippi and the South generally, I think it tends to it's much more complex when it comes to race and those kinds of things in these issues than I think people realize. It's not always, it doesn't always play entirely like a stereotype. It's much more complex.
We had a bunch of other questions and comments. We had Helen down in Copper.
Let me give you my email. In fact, it's
sure, that'd be great. Yeah.
Which way did I need to go? Okay, here we go. It's on the screen.
It's well done.
Jerry.Mitchell@MississippiCIR.org. And like I said, you can follow me on Twitter. That's my Twitter account, which I think links to my Facebook account as well. So, but anyway, I post the link to Facebook, so you can get to it that way as well.
Well, this was fantastic, Jerry. Thank you.
I enjoyed it, Wiley. Thanks for all the questions, everybody. Sorry we didn't get to them all. I ended up blabbing too long. So.
No, it's great. It's perfect. And I would encourage all of you to come back and join us a week from tonight when we are with Ed Tarkington to discuss his new novel, The Fortunate Ones, that asks something to the question at one point in the novel, why do the poor so envy the rich, or something to that effect? And it's a question that I would love to know as well. Why do we extend so much grace to the uber wealthy? And Gatsby is always in the news. This is a Gatsby tale of sorts, and Ed is a great writer and just a great person over there in Nashville. So please join us February 18th at 7 p.m. Jerry, good night. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Everybody.
We will see you next time on this event.